Okay, folks, I think we're going to get started now. We're a couple minutes past 6 o'clock. And my name's Melissa Melewsky. I'm a media law attorney with the Pennsylvania NewsMedia Association. And my organization is a nonprofit trade association that represents the interests of print and digital media organizations like Spotlight PA and has done so for the past 100 years. And we also promote our primary purpose is to promote a free and fair press. Tonight, we're here on behalf of Spotlight PA, an independent, nonprofit, nonpartisan newsroom that produces investigative and public service journalism about state government and urgent statewide issues. And you can support their work, including more behind the scenes event like this one on spotlightpa.org. That's spotlightpa.org. Before we get started, there's going to be a few housekeeping items I want to cover. Tonight's event will be recorded and posted on the Spotlight PA website tomorrow, for those of you who could not join tonight. And thank you to everyone who submitted a question in advance. If you'd like to submit a question during event, please do so in the Q&A section at the bottom of your screen, and we will try to get to as many of them as we can towards the end of the program tonight. I'm joined by Spotlight PA's Wyatt Massey, the only full-time investigative reporter dedicated to covering Penn State, the largest and arguably the most influential university in Pennsylvania. Massey has revealed deep-rooted flaws in the university's misconduct reporting apparatus, as well as potentially serious problems in its healthcare system. Tonight, we're going to hear about what happens behind the scenes to make investigations possible and the impact from this ongoing reporting. Wyatt, thank you for joining us tonight.
Yeah, absolutely.
If you are interested in more Spotlight events, among other benefits, there's access to exclusive member-only events for any readers that make donations to support the local journalism. And you can become a member at spotlightpa.org/donate. So Wyatt, you can follow Wyatt on Blue Sky. You can also read more about Wyatt's work on the Spotlight PA website. You just put in his name, /Wyatt-Massey. But let's start out by asking you about kind of the nuts and bolts. What are the biggest challenges about covering an organization like Penn State, and how do they differ from other large Pennsylvania universities in your experience?
Yeah, so I've been with Spotlight PA for about 2.5 years. The reason my position was created kind of at the intersection of our local state college bureau and then the investigative team is that Penn State University occupies a very unique place in Pennsylvania. So it's a land grant university. It employs, tens of thousands of people. It educates nearly 88,000 people in a given year and has this huge economic impact on the Commonwealth. But it is a state-related university. So that is kind of a special distinction that gives Penn State and the other state-relateds greater independence from the state legislature. And it also makes them largely exempt from our state's open records law. So it's Penn State, the University of Pittsburgh, Temple University, and Lincoln University are the four state-relateds. But Penn State, in terms of its geographic size with campuses throughout the state, as well as the size of its, student enrollment, is the biggest. So the biggest challenge in that typically is just determining kind of which stories we want to do because Penn State is so big. There's so much going on, and trying to pick, how to look at things systemically. And the challenge with that too is the lack of transparency we've seen from the university, some of which is sort of embedded by the state law and not being subject to the Open Records Act.
I want to touch on that next because the right to know law, as you and I know, is a tool that's used to increase government transparency and to provide public documents about what an agency is doing so that the public can hold their government institutions accountable. It's also subject to strict deadlines, and there are a number of exemptions that tell agencies what they should and must release and may hold back. Why is Penn State not subject fully to the right to know law? And you've already kind of touched on a little bit of it, but what's the further explanation for our audience?
Yeah, so that state-related distinction means that the university has to report some basic information to the state, but is largely exempt from the open records law, unlike the PASHE system, which is. So my understanding is the open records law was rewritten in the late 2000s. And during this time, Penn State's then President Graham Spanier testified to state lawmakers and basically made the argument that Penn State being included in the right to know law, being subject to the open records law, would go far beyond making Penn State accountable. He argued that it would make Penn State less competitive than other universities to have that level of transparency. And apparently that argument was persuasive, but I guess, Melissa, you can probably weigh in more on how that fits in with the specific law.
Sure. So briefly, I mean, the answer to why Penn State is treated differently is because that's the way the law was written. And Graham Spanier and other lobbying that took place in 2007 as the law was being drafted played a big part in that. But what we saw this past legislative session was legislators realizing that maybe they didn't go far enough with Penn State in that initial right to know law rewrite in 2007, 2008 when it was passed. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the recent changes were that occurred in the last legislative session that applied to Penn State and the other state-related universities?
Yeah, so connected to their annual funding bill was sort of an expansion of the things that the universities have to report to the state. So the new requirements mandate that the universities release some financial information about specific academic and support units. They have to provide information about their contracts that are worth more than about $5,000. And then they need to detail the salaries of the top 200 highest paid employees. So the previous law was just the top 25. And then there were some other bits in the law that Penn State was already complying with, such as making public the minutes of its board meetings. So it increased the types of things that Penn State is reporting to the state and therefore making public, but it is still not at the same level as other public universities in other states that kind of hold that flagship status for their state.
So, for example, you couldn't get Penn State's contract with Nike that shows the relationship between those two organizations, or Pepsi, or the name, image, likenesses that are meted out by the athletics department or anything like that. Or from the campus police, for example, you can't get access to those kinds of records. They're not reached under this new amendment to the right to know law.
Yeah, that's correct. And things like employee salaries, where at other university systems, you could see the salaries of all employees, which is helpful to see things like pay disparities, or when people are supposedly given raises, or how different academic units are paid, and then really granular budget information to say year to year, this unit was cut by X percent, this specific unit was boosted by X percent. That's really difficult to do just with the level of information that is made public.
So there's been some improvement, but like you said, they're still not covered the way
right.
A state system of higher education school would be, or other similarly situated organizations in other states. Yeah. So what kind of records have you been able to get through the right to know law?
When Penn State interacts with other organizations that are subject to the right to know law, we can access those records. So if Penn State is, interacting and filing information or sending information to the State Department of Education or to the Department of Agriculture or the government's office, those agencies are generally subject to the right to know law. So we can get those things by requesting, making those requests through those other agencies. But it's somewhat challenging because you have to know what to ask for. So I can't just go to the Department of Education and say, give me every document that Penn State has given you. That's way too broad, and the request will be denied. So it creates challenges where in other instances at other universities, you could just go to the university. You could just go to the University of Michigan and file your request for those records. You kind of have to go and figure out the back doors and workarounds to access those records.
And you've written a lot about Penn State's Board of Trustees recently. Why is this an area of interest? Why are you focusing on that in your coverage?
Yeah, well, like we've talked about, the university is this massive organization. It has this huge statewide presence, huge workforce. But I think there are kind of two sets of power brokers within the organization. So one would be the upper echelons of the administration, so like the president, her cabinet. And then the other would be the board of trustees. So the board oversees many aspects of the university. It includes approving the budget, building projects, and they have a fiduciary responsibility for Penn State's future. So, if Penn State wants to do a $700 million renovation of Beaver Stadium, that needs board approval. When Penn State wants to make deep cuts to its Commonwealth campus system, that needs essentially board approval through the budget. So the decisions that the board makes, the votes they take, the votes they don't take, the things they discuss, the things they don't discuss do have a lot of impact. But at the same time, I think there was a lot that was unknown about the board. This came up a lot with the creation of my position. Folks in and around Penn State felt like they didn't really understand how the board operates, how decisions were made, where decisions were coming from. And it could feel like, the presidential administration of the university or the board would just sort of hand down these big decisions. And people wanted to kind of see and better understand how the sausage is made, so to speak. So with our reporting, we found some pretty serious questions about board operations. So for example, there's a group of top board members that make up what's called the executive committee. So this committee is made up of the board chair and then the leadership of all the other various committees. And you can see that each year, new members were being added to the committee, but that executive committee, so that top group of trustees, had not held a public meeting since 2011. And our reporting showed that executive committee had been meeting in private, conduct that could have been running afoul of, the Pennsylvania's open meetings law, which requires, public business to be conducted in public. The university's argument is that this executive committee was meeting to do planning, setting agendas, deciding what was going to be talked about. And again, it's a little unclear how that aligns with Pennsylvania's open meetings law. But I am happy to say that last October, that board's executive committee began holding public meetings again for the first time in 13 years.
Did they do did they say publicly why they were doing that?
So it was their statements were just sort of change in operation. The idea was to have the executive committee meet to plan and discuss, the upcoming full board meeting to include better improve efficiency. So it sounded kind of similar to what they were allegedly doing in private, but it's hard to know because, the private meetings before were private.
Yeah. So you recently wrote a few stories, and you've touched on them a little bit about the board's deliberation and voting habits by analyzing what they've done over previous meetings. Tell us how you came up with the idea for those stories and how you gathered all that information to report on it.
Yeah, I mean, in previous jobs, I covered, city councils, school boards, other local governing bodies, and those can be pretty sleepy affairs. The sausage making of local government is slow. It can be tedious. Those meetings and work sessions can be really long. Have discussions about including this sentence in the proposal and excluding this one, or where to put the comma, the writing and rewriting. But that's just how, governments work. So when I started covering Penn State, it was striking to me that there was hardly any public discussion of board proposals or changes to proposals or questions to build consensus. There wasn't very many instances or hardly any at all instances, of a proposal coming up and, a trustee saying, you're proposing it doing it XYZ way. Have we thought about ABC way? Or, yeah, I'm on board with this part, but I can't really support this part. That kind of consensus building just wasn't happening in public. And that it was just sort of striking compared to how other local governing bodies sort of operate. So that was always sort of anecdotal or kind of qualitative data, but we wanted to see if we could quantify it, so to speak. So last year, we did two stories kind of around this topic. The first was tracking how much time Penn State's board spends deliberating on their meetings. So deliberation, is like the discussion that board members have before they vote. This would be the time to, talk about the proposal, whether you like it, dislike it, what parts you do, what parts you do like, what parts you don't like. So to track this, I watched every single board meeting going back to 2019. So 5 years of board meetings, measuring the length of the entire meeting. So when the meeting starts, when the meeting ends, that length of time. And then for every item that was voted on, essentially starting a stopwatch when the deliberation process started to see how much time, the board actually spends working through these proposals in public. So we found that Penn State's board over that 5-year span spent about 7.6% of their meetings actually deliberating university business. So if you take that for an hour-long meeting, that's about 4.5 minutes actually discussing board proposals. And then from that, big set of deliberations, so you take all the time they spent deliberating over 5 years, there was 2 topics that were most likely topics of discussion for the board. So about 2/3 of the time they spent deliberating proposals, they were talking about internal operations. So, how people get on the board, how they stay on the board. And the other topic they spent a lot of time talking about was athletics. The second story we did was very similar, looking at voting patterns over that 5-year span. So, tracking every single vote, who's voting no, and, do the proposals pass? So we found that 85% of all board proposals pass without a single dissenting vote. And in fact, many trustees had not actually voted against any proposals that came from the administration, and they had only voted against proposals brought by their fellow trustees. So I think those 2 stories kind of in conversation with each other can be enlightening. But, to be clear, I don't think anyone wants a board that's dysfunctional and can't pass anything and there's constantly fighting. But if you're sort of not building consensus, it raises questions of why that's not happening in public. Why aren't alternatives being weighed in public? And these proposals, when they come up, are essentially all but assured to pass. And that is sort of striking to me because in 2022, when President Bendaputi's administration announced that there was this structural budget deficit of around $150 million, that budget deficit has led to some major cuts across the university, major changes, contracts not being renewed, buyouts. And when that budget deficit was announced, I was at that meeting, and members of the board, acted surprised that the university's budget had gotten so bad. They made comments about, we had no idea. We had never had access to this kind of information. And I just think that raises some meaningful questions about, how the board operates, what questions they're asking, and the considerations that they're taking before voting, because they do approve the university's budget and they have to do it every year, essentially.
So you publish stories that rely on internal communications and other records like emails. And we've just discussed why the right to know law doesn't really reach that kind of information. So how are you getting access to those records?
Yeah, without being able to use an open records law to access some of those things, we're really dependent on people in the know sharing information with us, whether that is tips, whether that is records such as, emails, memos, plans. So that's really coming from people with access to that information. And those records become really critical for us to do our work, answering questions about what's happening internally, providing context to, some of the university's plans. And the people that share those things obviously have their motivations for doing so. So we have to be, conscious of that and weigh the value of the information they're providing, place it in a proper context, and kind of most importantly, corroborate it. So some people, want to share information with us and then walk away. Others, kind of want to be more involved in our reporting process, answering questions, kind of connecting us with other things. So it's really dependent on the person and their desire to be involved. We're also very open and willing to talk to people about, the steps we can take to protect you as a source. We've done some reporting around retaliation within some parts of the university. So we always want to be sensitive to not put people at unnecessary risks. So for people that do, want to share information, my contact information is public. I'm happy to walk through our steps if with protecting sources. And I know Spotlight PA also has a website that has information about how to share information securely, because we want to, take those steps to protect people, because that is such an important part of our reporting process.
What's been your experience in finding people at Penn State? Like, do they typically come to you? Do you have to hunt them down? Is it a mix of the two?
It's a mix. Yeah, some people come to us with tips, with information. Other times, if we're working off a tip or if we're working on a story, you're sort of like figuring out who might have access to this information and calling them and kind of building sources. It's a lot of, calling wrong numbers or leaving messages for people and kind of trial and error and just continually trying. You might call 10, 20, 30 people and only have 2 or 3 get back to you. But if you, take that ratio and end up calling 100 people, then now you've got 10. So it's a lot of just, a mix of people reaching out and us contacting them.
And some of your stories have featured anonymous sources, and you've already kind of touched on the need to protect certain sources. How do you decide whether a source stays anonymous? Because it does raise issues as part of the news gathering process.
Yeah, it's really a case by case basis. It depends on the information they're sharing, their proximity to the information, their position. So we're not going to run a story with an anonymous source who says, I heard this from a friend who heard it from a friend who heard it from someone else who actually overheard someone talking about it, at Waffle Shop. That's not ethical. But if the person comes to us, and says, I was in this meeting on this day and, the vice president of XYZ said this, that's something that we can start to work with. And that's a question of, how valuable the information is, how newsworthy is it? But we also want to be clear that we don't run anonymous sources without corroborating their claims, though. So a person might have a tip or information, and we decide, yes, the information they have, their position, it makes sense to use them as an anonymous source. But even if they're anonymous and if they're on the record, we're going to go through the process of trying to corroborate that claim. So can we find other people who, were in the same meeting or witnessed the same thing? Did that source tell other people what they saw? Did they write it down in a contemporaneous, email or text to someone? Are there other records that we can find to corroborate it? Because regardless of the person is anonymous or on the record, with their name, there's a certain threshold that we want to make sure we meet so that we're comfortable with publishing it. And then we have a very rigorous fact-checking process for our stories that it goes through, and we can say, like, this sentence, how do you know this? What are your sources for it? What documents do you have? And that goes to an editor that is pretty hands-off in the reporting process. So when it comes to him, he's very fresh and looking at it, has no idea. And he can kind of start to poke holes through stuff to make sure that we're meeting that threshold in order to feel comfortable publishing the story.
So I'm going to hop over to some of the lawsuits that Spotlight PA has ongoing at this point involving Penn State. So in 2023, Penn State appealed a ruling from the Pennsylvania Office of Open Records to block the release of a public records request that you made to the state departments of education and agriculture. And you won those cases at the Office of Open Records. You won access to records that involved Penn State, and Penn State got involved and said, no, I don't think we want to do that. Tell us a little bit more about those cases and what were the records that you asked for and why were they essential to your reporting?
Yeah, so I should start off by saying I'm not a lawyer. Melissa is, but I can give the general contours of this. So on Penn State's board, there are 3 trustees who are also secretaries of state agencies. So the way the law, and with Penn State's creation, whoever is the Secretary of Education in Pennsylvania, the Secretary of Agriculture, and the Secretary of Conservation and Natural Resources whoever is in that position, it is also their job to be a trustee of the university. So we've talked about the kind of, near total exemption from the open records law. There was a court case about a decade ago. It was called Bagwell versus the Department of Education. And in it, it was decided and it became precedent, that these agency secretaries, because it is part of their state job to serve on Penn State's board, the records they receive, the materials they receive to carry out their trustees' duty at Penn State University is subject to the open records law because it is part of their state job to be on the board. So all that to say, in 2023, I filed a records request with the State Department of Education. I wanted a copy of the materials that the education secretary was given, for Penn State's annual board retreat, and then for materials given to the secretary for a specific meeting that had happened like the year prior. Those files are hosted on like a file sharing service, so essentially on the cloud. In this file sharing service that Penn State uses is called Diligent. So with that, the university can control, who has access, whether someone can download the information or just look at it. So I made that request to the Department of Education. The Department of Education ended up denying the request, saying, we don't possess these records, therefore we can't give them to you. So I filed an appeal with the Pennsylvania Office of Open Records, asking essentially the state to weigh in whether these records should be made public. My argument, hewed pretty closely to, the Bagwell case that I mentioned and a couple other cases, saying like these files are digital, but they're also necessary for the secretary to carry out their duties on the board. Therefore, they should be public. During that appeal process, the university intervened as an interested party, submitted its own argument, pretty similar that, the Department of Education doesn't possess these records, it is not their duty to turn them over, therefore they cannot be made public. And in September of 2023, the Pennsylvania Office of Open Records ruled partly in my favor, essentially that some of the records I had been requesting needed to be made public within 30 days. And then the State Department of Education and Penn State appealed that ruling to the Commonwealth Court, and we've been waiting essentially ever since. My understanding is we're sort of just waiting whether the Commonwealth Court is going to pick our case for oral arguments, but nothing immediate on that. And the Department of Agriculture that you mentioned before, very similar case with the denial of electronic records. So those cases have been combined in the Commonwealth Court.
And once you get to the Commonwealth Court, you're operating on their time frame. They don't have, like, the right to know law has some strict time frames involved. The
Yes.
court does not. So hopefully we'll get some progress on those cases soon. In the same vein, Spotlight PA is also pursuing Pennsylvania's other primary public access law. We have the right to know law for public records, and we have the Sunshine Act for public meetings. And Pennsylvania's Board of Trustees is covered. They are considered an agency for purposes of Pennsylvania's Sunshine Act. They're required to deliberate agency business in public, and they're required to take official action at a public meeting. So in 2023, Spotlight PA again sued the university. This time it's Board of Trustees, alleging violations of, well, I shouldn't say again sued. They sued they brought a Sunshine Act violation case against Penn State rather than being sued by Penn State, alleging Sunshine Act violations. Can you tell us a little bit more about what's going on in that case?
Yeah. So as we talked about, we've done a lot of reporting around the Board of Trustees and their use of private meetings. And that reporting has raised some pretty serious questions about, the board's transparency and whether they're complying with the law. And there's kind of an important distinction because within the law, there's two kind of provisions allowing private meetings. One is an executive session and one is a conference session. So as not the lawyer, I'll defer to you, Melissa, to explain the difference between those two.
So a conference is typically, it's a statutorily defined term, and it is typically defined as a training session where the board gets into a room and they're receiving information. I think of it as a one-way street. A conference is someone with some expertise is presenting information to the board, who is sitting there and listening. Under the Sunshine Act, deliberation of agency business is expressly prohibited during a conference. So if you have an agency that's taking that information they're receiving from an expert and they're saying, how do we apply it in this situation? What policies can we create? How do we put this into a contract? That's considered deliberation of agency business. And if that happens during a conference, that's subject to Sunshine Act penalties. It's a potential violation if you bring it before a judge. So that's what a conference is. I think of it as a one-way street of information coming to the agency members and not going any further. They can talk about it later at a public meeting, but not during the conference because the Sunshine Act says they cannot. An executive session, on the other hand, is an allowable exception to the law where an agency, for certain limited purposes, can go into a private session and deliberate agency business. There are, I think, 7 exceptions. Executive session exceptions. The most common I hear about involve personnel matters, to discuss issues that are confidential by law. There's a real estate exemption that allows you to talk about the purchase or acquisition of public property, not the sale. But there are a number of exemptions that the legislature has determined. There are a number of situations the legislature has determined they require privacy in some situations. They're allowed to deliberate in those situations. Conferences, again, you cannot deliberate agency business. Executive sessions, you may, if certain conditions are met.
Yeah, so we've done a lot of reporting around and kind of those topics and the board's operations. And in October of 2023, we worked with the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press to write a letter essentially to Penn State's general counsel, the president, and the board chair, kind of noting our concerns with how the board was using executive sessions and conference sessions, and the importance of openness and transparency given Penn State, public university, land grant university. Asked the university to kind of change its practices. We offered to meet with them to discuss our concerns and ask for a response, before their next meeting. University's response from their general counsel was essentially, we are following the law. So it was at that next meeting in November of 2023. I went to attend one of the board's committee meetings. I arrived a few minutes early, saw that people were inside, so I walked in. It turns out that I walked into what I believe to be an executive session of either that committee or the full board. It wasn't really clear. That private meeting was not advertised. And there was this sort of awkward moment where people were telling each other to stop talking, stop the meeting. I was asked to leave, which I did. But the public meeting of that committee started a bit later. It lasted for 10 minutes and then went back into executive session. And there was no clear reason given at the time for why or what that other meeting was about. That was kind of one instance. And then the next day is usually when the board has its full meeting. And I went to the location where the board was holding what it advertised as its conference and or executive session. As we talked about, those are two, legally distinct terms, two different types of gatherings with different requirements. So I went, and the university employee told me, I couldn't attend, which is fine. It was a private meeting. And I asked, what kind of meeting is it? And, the employee said, well, this is a conference session. But later in the day at the board's full board's public meeting, the board chair described that session as an executive session. And those are two different things. So, kind of with our previous reporting, the letter that we had sent, and then the conduct that we saw in that November meeting, that became the basis of the lawsuit that we filed against the university's board, with the help of Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. We filed that in December of 2023, alleging the university's board was misusing the open records law. That case, we've updated it twice. Like our complaint, we've updated it twice with new information and similar conduct that we saw at the board's February 2024 meeting. And then again, after the board's, I think, May 2024 meeting, when they were discussing the renovation to Beaver Stadium. During that meeting, the board chair sort of cut off questions and the deliberation of some trustees, and in under the auspices of we've had a lot of time to discuss this. We've had deliberations on this before, and suggesting that there had been deliberations in these executive sessions, and they already had enough time so they can move forward with the vote on that renovation project. So that was our third, or it was our second update, but it's technically our third amended complaint in that lawsuit. And that case is still pending. So we're kind of waiting for next steps there, but I do think, the two lawsuits really matter because Pennsylvania is a public university. It receives hundreds of millions of dollars of taxpayer funds just for its education mission, and then much, much more, state and federal tax money for research and other projects. So I think the public does have a right to know, what the governing body of Penn State is discussing, whether it's conducting public business in public or whether it's conducting what should be public business in private.
And with that in mind, I'll mention, or I guess I'll ask, for those of us, and for those of you in the audience, Pennsylvania's Sunshine Act is the law that requires public agencies to deliberate and take official action at a properly advertised public meeting.
Yep.
And this law exists so that the public can both witness and participate in the formation of public policy and government decision making. It is really the public's voice in its own governance. And Penn State is expressly subject to the law. What about other universities? Can you tell us about that, Wyatt?
Yeah, I mean, other universities being subject to the open meetings law? Yeah, they are.
Yeah.
Well, and I should say too that we have our lawsuit, but to my knowledge, there's two other lawsuits pending related to transparency from the board, and those other two lawsuits have been brought by current trustees alleging transparency and board operation concerns. And to my knowledge, those are both still active at this point.
And your Sunshine Act, your right to know law is at the appellate level at the Commonwealth Court, but your Sunshine Act, that's pending where? In the Court of Common Pleas in Center County?
Center County, yep.
Okay, so you're at the trial court level.
Yep.
Okay, thanks. I think at this point, we'll turn to questions from the audience. And there were some that were submitted in advance, and I thank you all for doing that. I'm going to hit on some of those. So from Lindsay T, how do you, Wyatt, deal with the university halting your coverage? Like, do they get in your way? Are there barriers, roadblocks, gags on employees?
So anecdotally, we have heard, like employees being told, not to talk to us. That isn't necessarily a unique Penn State thing. I mean, I can say that in 2.5 years of covering the university, I've been granted 2 official interviews by Penn State's communications office. One happened in the first month or so that I'd been here, and one was for a shorter story that was around kind of increased transparency for misconduct reporting, which had been a subject of a big project that we had done. So I still have not talked to the president of the university. We've tried at a board meeting last year. It was in Altoona, Pennsylvania. The board had a meeting, and we had just done a lot of reporting around Penn State Health's abdominal transplant program, and that program had abruptly shut down with some concerns brought by federal regulators and oversight body. And the vice chair of Penn State's board also sits on the Penn State Health board. And the health system had, pledged to conduct this full and independent review of what had happened, looking at what had led to this sudden closure. And we had not been able to get anything, from the health system about where that review stood. So after the board meeting concluded in Altoona, I went up to the vice chair essentially to ask, do you have any comment? What's going on with this review? I got maybe one question in, and the person in charge of Penn State Strategic Communications intervened and said, you have to submit all your questions to us in writing. It was sort of this awkward moment where the person I wanted to talk to was right there, but I was now being asked to submit questions in writing via email so that, Penn State's communications office could turn around if they wanted to answer the question and then ask someone else to answer them, take them back, rewrite them in an email to me. This like very long process when I had just wanted to ask the vice chair of Penn State University a question. So it has been challenging, but then there's other times where, employees reach out to us, people want to share information. They have these questions, they are hearing things, and they can't get straight answers from their superiors. So we can kind of hopefully fill a need in uncovering some things and reporting about what's happening within the university.
You've already mentioned the fact that you've watched 5 years of Board of Trustees meetings and you're doing the Lord's work. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Holly H. asked, does Penn State provide public meetings on Zoom video with contact numbers for follow-up questions? So in practice, what are they doing?
Yeah, so the boards, to my knowledge, all of the board's public meetings are live streamed, even the in-person ones. The board's committees and the full board has regularly scheduled in-person meetings, and then kind of throughout the year, if something pops up, they might have a Zoom-only meeting. But if you go to, I guess I don't know the website, but just search Penn State trustees, that website, there's a meetings tab, and you can see the scheduled meetings, and there should be a Zoom live stream link there. So you just kind of got to monitor for when they are and then log on. It can be kind of hard if it's an in-person meeting. It's just one camera angle. So if there's a lot of talking that's not the board chair, it can be a little confusing, but you can absolutely watch. In terms of public comment, the board does not take live in-person public comment. You have to submit your public comment in writing ahead of time. And those public comments are not read at the board meeting. They'll be summarized by the board chair, but they are posted online. So it's not the same as a city council where you can go and have your 2 or 3 minutes in front of the board, but they are posted publicly.
Thanks. How much of the school being its kind of own ecosystem and economic force in central PA and throughout the state, how does that affect your ability to report? And that question was submitted by Zachary B. Thank you, Zachary.
I think sort of the lack of legal obligation for transparency can create, at least feed a somewhat insular culture. At the same time, Penn State is this massive organization. It has incredible brand recognition in Pennsylvania. It has a very popular and successful football team. And I think there's this term called like a halo effect. So people sort of look very fondly upon the university for their experiences there, the fact that they love Penn State football. They're treated at a Penn State Health hospital. So it can be somewhat difficult sometimes when there are people talking about problems for those individuals to be believed in their communities. And then sort of if we're doing reporting around problems, getting people to sort of take us seriously. So it requires a lot more corroboration and building up our sourcing, but it's not that much different than covering any very large corporation. State College is essentially a company town, but the company isn't like a mill, isn't a steel mill or a big manufacturing plant. It's the university, and everyone that sort of lives in State College and around State College has some tie to the university. They might work there, their spouse does, they went there. And the same can be said for like many pockets of the state, because Penn State has 20 campuses, it has a giant health system. So that does create challenges, but it also creates a lot of people that are in the know of things because they care a lot about the university and its success.
Yeah. I mean, in the same vein, Howard K asks, what's the most difficult part of covering the university, and has your relationship become adversarial? I mean, outside the context of the adversarial lawsuits that are currently pending, but.
Well, so like I mentioned, the biggest challenge, one is figuring out what stories to do, and then also when we get tips or we're hearing things or we're considering, it's like I'm only one person. So, the stories we choose to cover means we're not covering other things. So there's a lot of questions around, is there harm here? Is this systemic? It's sort of difficult, but like sometimes people reach out about having a bad boss. But is it a systemic problem? Is this person's, alleged misconduct known by superiors? Can we put it in part of a larger trend? And that can be somewhat difficult too, to say like, yeah, I believe you. This sounds horrible. It sounds like you're in a bad situation, but I don't necessarily know if we can do something larger with that, because we want to have a bigger, for like a project and sinking time, and they want to have a bigger sense of the harm and the potential impact of whatever's going on. In terms of the adversarial relationship, I mean, I think we try to be very clear with the university, with our stories. A lot of times in our stories, you can see our interaction with the communications officers. And we have a process, especially around any big project at Spotlight PA. It's what we call internally a no surprises letter. So I might be working on a story for 6 months, 8 months, and we have a big project, has these conclusions. Throughout the process, we're probably asking Penn State questions, trying to get official interviews. But now we're getting close to publishing. We have our findings, so to speak. So in this no surprises letter, we're essentially telling the university, this is everything that we are going to put in the story. It's not the story as it's going to appear, but it's sort of the condensed, just the facts. Here's our findings. And we send that no surprises letter so that when we do publish, there won't be any surprises, and we give them the opportunity to push back, so if there's something wrong with our findings, just so they're very clear about what's going to be published, and give them that opportunity to respond. And that's typically a time where we do get information back, if it's been challenging to get information, in the lead up to that, because we can say like, look, here's our deadline. This is what we're going to publish. If you want to be part of this, like, here's your opportunity we'd be happy to meet. We'd be happy to talk. But these are our findings. So that's been really helpful too, just kind of being clear and consistent with covering the university too, to kind of build, here's our processes. We're going to give you sort of the same processes with any big project, big findings.
Mm-hmm. How do you go about covering branch campuses, if at all? What kind of, you're just, like you said, you're just one person and there's 20 campuses. How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the branch campuses are coming. There's going to be a lot of reporting around it. There's already been, I think there's big changes coming on top of the big changes that have already happened. So as the future of those campuses are changing, I know there's been stories this week about potential closures because the university won't provide a clear answer to what those future plans are for the Commonwealth, but the Commonwealth campuses are looking at very big cuts. So we did reporting around the buyouts that were offered. I think that's going to be an ongoing topic of our reporting. It is difficult, just being one person trying to get a sense of a lot of different branch campuses, but as those changes are being implemented, I think that's going to be a hot topic. So I'm always happy to talk to people about that and understand really the impacts that it's having on Penn State employees and the tough questions they're having to grapple with, when it's their livelihoods. It's going to be a big change and a big challenge.
Comparing Penn State, and this comes from Kathleen L., comparing Penn State with other land grant universities, have you seen any similarities, any differences? Is there something unique about Penn State?
Yeah, kind of going back to when we talked about those two stories about deliberation and the voting patterns, during that reporting process, I ended up talking to at least half a dozen, maybe, I don't know, between 6 and 10, other reporters that are covering their state's main university. So, like University of Michigan, Ohio State, the University of Wisconsin, Minnesota, talking to those reporters, people that had been covering the university for several years, saying, like, this is what I'm seeing at Penn State. Are you seeing something similar? And the feedback I got from those conversations is a lot of the times it seems like these governing bodies of major universities are pretty reticent to vote down proposals to really push back on the administration. So a lot of times, the proposals that are coming up are getting passed. A lot of the reporters I talk to, we're really struggling to think of a time that more than one, administrative proposal was, kind of shot down. The difference, though, is that apart from those agency secretaries, a lot of Penn State's trustees, the composition of the board is different than at other states and those universities. I think it's in Michigan, it's an elected position. People run for it, or in other states, like a governor appoints you to the board, where Penn State's board is much bigger. It has 36 voting members, and there's different kind of constituencies and ways to get on the board. There are some appointees, there's these secretaries, the agriculture industry gets to elect members to the board, and then the alumni also get to elect members of the board. So the composition is different, but it seems like some of the outcomes for those other universities are pretty similar. I will say the one other difference, though, is that at those other universities, their boards, or at least their leading administrators, are going to be subject to that open records law. So you could see, what meetings is the president taking, for example, or the kind of internal workings of those universities better than you could Penn State.
Thanks. And the next question we're going to talk to is from Brianna C. And she says, in the digital age where misinformation spreads rapidly, what ethical responsibilities do investigative journalists have to combat misinformation? How do you feel about that?
Hot take, misinformation is bad. Yeah, I mean, so yeah, there's the idiom, a lie gets halfway around the world or all the way around the world before the truth, gets its pants on. It's tough because, doing this work, you obviously don't want to spread misinformation, but you also have to keep up and keep providing factual information. But as there's more and more noise, it just requires almost going slower and being more clear, more deliberate in our fact-checking process, how we're vetting things, keeping up with ways to vet, AI created things. Luckily, I haven't ran into a ton of that, but just getting better and better about vetting, talking to people, corroborating more. It just creates the challenge. It ups the ante, so to speak. And yeah, there's an ethical obligation with so much, just BS misinformation out there to make sure that your I's are dotted and your T's are crossed when we hit publish.
In the same vein, James R. asks, has the university ever reached out to you to take an article, to take a story down that they feel you got wrong or is in fact misinformation? Has that ever happened?
Yeah, the university has pushed back several times about some characterizations of things. They didn't like certain headlines. And I've met with some of the people who had concerns, and it never came down to a factual error. It was they didn't like that a certain word was used or the way something was put in a headline. But we really try to be clear about, is this a factual error? You don't like that this information is out there, how it's presented. So to date, we haven't run any corrections. But of course, we're very sensitive to that. And with anything we publish, sensitive to if the university wants to push back, they want to have a conversation about something being factually wrong, in the event that it is, we have to stand by our obligation to have the facts in there. And, we will issue a correction if and when necessary.
And one final question tonight from Amy S. How do you work around the rather significant exemptions for Penn State in the right to know law? How do you, from a practical level, what does that mean for you?
Yeah, it's a lot of gathering information and about what records are out there that is being sent to other local, state, federal agencies that we can make requests to those agencies to try to get access to them. it's understanding the kind of, I won't call them loopholes, workarounds, to make those types of requests. And then it's a lot of sourcing with people in and around the university, who might have access to that information. And then, being open to when people have tips or what they want to share internal records. I can't necessarily solicit, or ask people to, like download something and send it to me, but I can always be open to when they do, receiving it, talking about it, having a sense or getting a sense of where they are and, the information they want to get out there. So it's kind of a hodgepodge of, or a patchwork of those types of things, and kind of just always being open, always trying to have a sense of what's going on. And, just doing your best every day, or trying to do your best every day to keep up with stuff when there isn't that legal obligation to just provide records upon request.
Do you find yourself, as a reporter, just visiting campus, just looking for sources, like, kind of gumshoeing it, or are you squarely focused on receiving information, electronic communications, downloads, things like that? Like, is there a balance? Do you do both?
Yeah, it is a balance. I do both. Generally found though that reaching out to people not in person is somewhat easier. Just because, visiting someone at their office, if they've been told not to talk to us, they're pretty likely not, to like be thrilled that we show up or want to talk to us. But if I talk to them, later, after work on the phone or through like an encrypted, messaging service, they might be much more open to that. So it's a mix of things. And sometimes we do need to talk to this person. We have to get their comment, or we have to give them the opportunity to respond. So that is door knocking. That is trying to show up where they are.
Mhm.
But in terms of building trust with a source that might be wary, I never think it's a good idea to just like show up and put them on the spot at their place of work if I want to talk to them about their place of work.
Yeah. So I think that's all the time we have for tonight. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you, Wyatt, for sharing your insight, and thank you, Spotlight, for getting us all on the same page.
Yeah, thanks everyone for coming.